Hey guys, okay. Just to start off with, what was the spark that started World War One and who was involved? So, what was we have our main causes, right? Military alliances, industrialism, or imperialism and nationalism. But what is the spark? Okay, so hopefully you said the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip and all of that, which would be correct. All right. Again, I think Gavrilo Princip is the most important man in modern day history. Not because of anything, or just because of what he does sets off the rest of our modern day world. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on World War One. Last class we talked a lot about alliances, or we focused on that during the alliance or that last lecture. One thing I want to bring up though is really that importance of militarism, and we're going to talk about that, but please keep that in mind. Additionally, alliances can change, and they change pretty rapidly right off the bat of World War One. Okay, so if you remember, you had the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente of Russia, Great Britain, and France. Well, when the war officially kicks off, that changes, okay? Austria-Hungary's, let me move this, sorry. Austria-Hungary's declaration of war against Serbia sets off that chain reaction within the alliance system. The countries of Europe are going to follow through on their pledge to support one another. And then as a result, within like 6 weeks of the assassination, basically the entire continent of Europe was pulled into war. So by mid-August 1914, there were clear battle lines drawn. On one side, you had Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. And those are known as the Central Powers. If you notice on here, Italy is no longer a part of that alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Okay, we're going to get there in a minute. Ottoman Empire joined Germany, Austria-Hungary because they are hoping that if they are on the right side of this war, then they will gain back territory that they lost. So that's their motivation. Additionally, they didn't want to lose any more territory, and so they were like, let's just give this a whirl. The Allied powers on the other side were Great Britain, France, and Russia. Okay, now Japan will join the Allies powers within a few weeks. Japan doesn't need another war with Russia. They really don't want to worry about that. And Japan was very industrial, like getting really industrialized. And even though they had already won a war against Russia, it really wasn't on their horizons, to have another war with it. Okay. Italy also joins the Allied powers. So Italy had a defensive alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, meaning that they would defend them if they were attacked. But since Germany and Austria-Hungary are the first ones to declare war, Italy backs out and says, that's not what my alliance is a part of, and they flip and join France, Russia, and Great Britain, and then all what you can see here, like in that kind of greenish or tan color, whatever that is. Okay. So these two will be the big superpower blocks. These are the powers that will come together and fight each other, okay? The war itself, food, ammunition, troops, mail, orders, all of it's delivered through this very, this trench system, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, okay? These trenches, I'll wait. I'll talk more about trenches in just a minute. Yeah. Okay, so the war has started, and now we got to talk about recruitment and how we're going to PR it so it works for our favor. So here's some examples. Okay, London, America. We want you for the U.S. Army. We want you. Your country needs you. London, you. Okay, so that's really pulls on the strings of nationalism. This is an Australian poster depicting the Germans. So they will be depicted as this kind of character throughout World War I and some of World War II as well. I'll explain why public opinion switches so fast about how Germans are displayed. American poster to destroy the mad brute, enlist in the U.S. Army. So it's just this idea that they were going to come and steal your children and steal your women and rape and pillage. It's not too far off of what happens in Belgium, so we'll get there. And then financing war, beat back the Huns, so like the Germans, beat them back, that kind of stuff. Additionally, another thing that people really leaned into for recruitment was this idea of the glory of war. Okay, so it had been, the generation that's going to war right now had not been in a war like this before. Well, no one had been in a war like this before, but specifically a war in general. And it was kind of this idea of like, it was your duty as a man to go and be part of a war and part of the army and everything else. So there was this great idea that the men were excited to go to war, and many were, but that's because they were basically told, like, you'll be home by Christmas, go have fun with some friends, kill some enemies, you'll come back, it'll be so glorious. No one was prepared for the aftermath. So many men were very excited for battle. And then you also have this image. So a little young kid getting like dressing up as if he is kind of has a cap on, backpacks, as like he's going off to war. And this is instilled at a very young age. And so what is it when a country instills at a very young age to be prideful of your country and that it is your duty to fight? Hopefully it's nationalism. Okay, we're going to get a little more detailed on the Schlieffen plan, but I just wanted you to be able to take a look at this and see what this looks like, because the next one's a little smaller. But when war breaks out, Germany figures out that it has 950 hours, so 39 days, okay, to avoid a two-front war. You have Germans, if you remember correctly, they were surrounded on both sides by enemies, France and Russia. And so Germany needed to avoid fighting a two-front war. Well, that two-front war, the whole idea was to get to France first and defeat them. So again, these generals figured out they had roughly 950 hours to do this, so 39 days to get from Germany, mobilize all their troops, get into France, get France to surrender, then turn around and be able to get back to Russia. Sounds a little lofty, right? One of the reasons they were like, we can so do this is because they had figured out that if you give your troops coke and like PCP kind of drugs, then they can keep going for hours and they're pretty undefeated. And that's kind of what happens. Okay, so let me give you a little background on this whole plan and how this comes to be. So when Franz Ferdinand shoots the Archduke, it basically sets off this ticking time bomb of like, who's going to attack first? Pretty much the leaders in Europe knew that a war was coming, and they thought, well, might as well do it now and get it over with. That was really like the end goal. Let's get this fighting over with in war, because they thought we wait any longer, countries could be stronger, and we just need to like move on and get this out of the way. Germany underestimates Russia's ability to mobilize, and they really underestimate how Belgium's going to fight back. So Belgium is a neutral country, and right when war breaks out, Great Britain is they're like, I think we're going to stay neutral. We need to stay out of that. I don't think this will impact us a whole lot. We are, we're really wealthy. We've got colonies over the place we have to worry about. We don't need to be involved in a war. But Germany screws all that up. Germany didn't want Great Britain to get involved. However, Germany's plan, the Schlieffen plan, involves them going through the neutral country of Belgium. Well, when they do this, they violate this neutrality pact. And part of the neutrality pact included an alliance with England and France that if anyone violated their neutrality, that England would come and step in. And so Germany's biggest mistake was doing that. So the first thing Germany did was they go to France and they're like, hey, before they execute this plan, hey, France, you need to stay out of this war. It's nothing to do with you. And France is like, we're going to act in our best interest. And Germany again says, no, really, you should stay out of it. And as an act of good faith, you should give us the keys, essentially, to this border here between France and Germany. So in 1914, this border between France and Germany was the most fortified border in the entire world. France was never going to do that. And Germany pretty much knew that too, but at least they had to pretend like they were asking. So instead, Germany goes to Belgium, neutral country, and says, hey, Belgium, we don't want to fight with you, but we need to get into France, and you're our best chance of getting through there. So how about you let us in? We'll go through your country. Nothing will be destroyed. And if anything does happen to be destroyed, we promise we'll replace it. And Belgium's like, okay, we're not idiots. We're not going to just roll over and you go through our country. We're neutral. That means we're not on either side. It means you need to stay out. And Germany said, well, we really can't do that. Well, when Germany first arrives to go through Belgium, they send people on bikes, like bicycles, like do bicycles. And they go in, and the Belgians just start blowing up bridges. They're like, we told you no, you can't come to our country. And Germany said to them, like, if you try to interfere with this, we're going to come after you. And Belgium was just like, okay, bring it. We're not just going to roll over. And so those pictures that you saw about like destroy the mad brutes, the Germans, those images come off of what they do in Belgium. In Belgium, they do burn down towns. They do burn down homes. They kill children. They kill women. They rape them. Like, they loot houses. Again, they're hopped up on a lot of drugs. Not saying that that's an excuse, but you can understand like at least the mind frame they were in. And so that PR gets out, and pretty much it becomes known that it now becomes like the Central Powers were rapers, looters, and pillagers and would kill you all, and let's get them, and they're horrible people. And the Allies powers were now like these like heroes, essentially. So the Schlieffen Plan fails, though, because Belgium resistance is a lot stronger, and Russia is able to mobilize much quicker than anyone expected. France had been funneling money into Russia. By the way, the French leader at the time, and no, wait, the Queen of England is cousins with the guy that's leading, Tsar Nicholas, who's leading Russia, and then France is also related. There are all these different monarchs and powers and emperors are like all related by blood. It's quite disturbing. Okay, so they get on in, and that immediately changes public opinion. All right, so in Great Britain. So Great Britain's like, well, great, now we have to get involved, and so they do. They get involved, and the war like really sets in and gets to place. Okay, so the first battle of the Marne. Okay, so that Schlieffen Plan does work in some ways, in that it gets them 30 miles outside of Paris. Okay, that's not very far. So they get 30 miles outside of Paris, and it looks like the French are about to have to surrender. I mean, very quickly it looks like this. And then the French recruit 600 taxi cab drivers, and they load them up with troops. And between 600 taxi cab drivers and a few different, like rounds, they were able to bring over 6,000 troops to the front lines, and weapons and ammunition and supplies and everything. And then because of that aid, the French were able to push the Germans back, pretty much back to the border between France and Germany. But how crazy is that? Can you imagine, like, you're sitting on the battlefield, you're German, and you're like, yeah, we got this. Next thing you know, you hear this rumbling of like 600 taxi cabs coming towards you. Interesting. Okay, let's talk about what's going on. Oh, whoops, sorry. All right, so we have this Western Front going on here, which is these trenches that were dug. So during the war, everything was supplied through the trenches. They were dug in zigzag patterns. They were made in ways to like kind of trap people in if you didn't know where you're going, like if the enemy's gotten to you. But the problem with these trenches is that, coupled with the new technology coming out of the Industrial Revolution and everything else, it results in a stalemate. Okay, so as the summer of 1914 turns to fall, the war turns into this long, bloody stalemate or deadlock. And this really occurs along this area between France and Germany, and then down here as well. However, I will say most of that Western Front action takes place here. But basically from here to here, it's 300 miles, and then we have another 200 if you combine everything together. All right, so this deadlock region in northern France became known as the Western Front. Both sides, Germans and French, or Allied and Central Powers, are going to dig in for the winter. And they had no idea that this conflict would turn into a long, deadly stalemate. The battle lines in France almost remain unchanged for 4 years. So one of the things to remember here about everything is that this is the first war, like full-out war, where you see national armies come together, a shift from private armies of the past, and a combination of the technology that has emerged and the means for people to mass produce weapons. No one was prepared for this, okay? Including civilian casualties, 50 million lives were lost during World War I. Prior to like the French Revolution and Napoleon nationalizing a whole army and that really taking off, you had armies of like 20,000 men, and that was large. So losing 2,000 meant 10% of your army, and that was a big loss. Life was valuable. With our shift into this national war machine where you can pick everybody, encourage your entire country to come on and defend you, coupled with the new weapons, life doesn't really matter anymore. 2,000 men, that's nothing. So we have a big shift that's occurring that, again, people weren't ready for. Men fighting were not ready for that, okay? By early 1915, opposing armies on the Western Front dug parallel lines of trenches to protect themselves from enemy fire. This sets the stage for trench warfare. Armies trade huge losses of life for small, pitiful land gains. Life in the trenches was pure misery. But let's listen to this, and I'll let these people tell you about it.
On the Western Front, the German assault had finally failed, and soldiers on both sides had raced to dig an elaborate trench system that stretched for 300 miles, from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. On New Year's Day in 1915, the young men who had gone off to fight glorious battles were now trapped in a desperate war of attrition.
Someone said to us excitedly, "Jack Smith." I said, "What about him?" "He's dead, he's been shot. The first one of the battalion to be shot." I said, "What?" "Yes, he's dead, he's been shot." He put his head too far over and a sniper got him. And that caused a bit of a sensation amongst the lads. They thought, well, this is not exactly what we come for kind of business. But later on, from that day onwards, when we went to the trenches, it was 3 killed, 4 killed, 5 killed, 20 killed, 100 killed. By then, we was veterans.
A young American poet, Alan Seeger, was among those looking for adventure when he joined the Foreign Legion to fight for France. His diary reveals how seldom he found it.
It's a miserable life, shivering in these wretched holes in the dirt. We're not leading the life of men at all, but that of animals, living in our holes in the ground, and only showing our heads outside to fight and to feed.
When we'd been there about 6 months, covered in mud, wet through practically all day, absolutely chewed up my lice. We used to say, and to think we wanted to come to this hole. I said, yes, we didn't know.
Every so often, one side or the other seized a few hundred yards of territory only to be forced back again, surrendering what had cost hundreds of lives to win. The front never moved more than a mile or two in either direction. By the spring of 1915, the generals had concluded that the best way out of the stalemate was to blast the enemy out of their trenches. The same factories and assembly lines that had begun to contribute to life in the 20th century were now retooled to create massive killing machines. This was the industrialization of war.
There was just the splintered trunks of trees, and there was the quagmire of the shell holes, and no grass. It was just like a lunar landscape, really.
At night, the rats, they grew to enormous sizes, feeding on the corpses there. It was impossible to get the dead buried.
We put dead bodies in the bottom of the trench so that we could stand on them to keep dry. And on some occasion, dead bodies was put on the top of the trench to make it higher, so that we could walk a bit better instead of crouching.
And contributing to the stalemate were new weapons. By now, the machine gun had been perfected to the point that a single soldier could command as much firepower as 40 riflemen. The tank made its first appearance, invented by the British to get through the dense thickets of barbed wire that protected the enemy trenches. And in April 1915, the Germans introduced the most terrifying weapon of all, poison gas.
No one had ever seen it before. This is the moment when chemical warfare was invented. It scared the living daylights out of the Canadian troops that were hit by it.
First World War had become a contest not of fighting spirit, but of technological might. And for the soldiers caught in the middle of it, there was no way forward and no way back. There was simply endurance.
You saw a little bush, and you swore that bush was somebody creeping up on you. The perfect soldier then in that war would have been somebody with no imagination whatsoever. We all had too much imagination.
So many men who had been through these dangers and anxieties, their nerve broke and they were the victims of shell shock, you know. There is a breaking point for most people, for everybody really. Robbed of all humanity and courage and everything else that makes life worth living, really. He's descended to something less than human.
Okay, we'll talk more about like the PTSD and the aftermath of World War One, but it does give you a highlight of just like how bad this really did get for many of our soldiers. You know, it's not like today where we talk about mental health. In 1918, it wasn't, let's go get you help. It was suck it up, move on. So there were a lot of issues following World War One. Okay, so this just, I wish I would highlight to you this two-front war. So you will have a multi-front war. We have the Western Front, which is right here where the trenches are dug in. And then the Eastern Front, which is here, pretty much dug in as well. Okay. So let's talk about the industrialization of the war. This, again, they already talked about this, but makes it an extremely deadly war. One of the main reasons why it becomes so deadly is this new technology that never been tested out before, and now, you got everybody testing out their weapons. So modern weapons add greatly to the destruction of the war. We know that rapid-fire machine guns mowed down waves of soldiers, making it nearly impossible to advance. Artillery allowed troops to shell enemy lines and cities for more than 10 miles away. In 1916, Britain introduces a new weapon, the armored tank. Mounted with machine guns, the tanks were designed to move across broken ground and through barbed wire. They did little to break the stalemate in the end, okay? Then you also have poison gas. In 1915, Germany is the first to use this that either blinded or choked its victims and caused agonizing burns and blisters. I'll show you a picture of one of them in a minute. Later that year, the Allies also began to use gases. So both sides are guilty of using gases. Those soldiers were eventually given gas masks. Poison gas remained one of the most dreaded hazards of the war. It could be fatal, and it was an uncertain weapon because say you're launching it, the wind might shift it back into your troops. So not as good. Both sides are going to use aircraft. At first, these planes are going to simply observe enemy troop movements. In 1915, Germany used Zeppelins, large gas-filled balloons, to bomb the English coast. Later, both sides are going to equip these planes with machine guns. And then you have pilots known as flying aces that battle around, like the Red Baron. Like Red Baron pizza comes from the Red Baron being this great fighter pilot in World War I. Okay, submarines end up proving much more useful. German submarines roamed the Atlantic, which were the first ones to do this. The submarine's primary weapon against ships was the torpedo. And these submarines, or U-boats, did extreme damage to the Allied side, sinking merchant ships. To counteract submarine warfare, the Allies organized convoys as well to protect the warships. Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, though, eventually is one of the things that brings the U.S. into war. Okay, and then we know machine gun, 100 rounds a minute, kill so many people. Okay, here are just some tanks. I just want to give you a couple more examples of tanks. Poisonous gas. So again, the Germans are the first ones to use poisonous gas, and the first use is chlorine gas at the Battle of Ypres in 1915. You're going to see a little slide on that in a minute. Chlorine gas causes a painful sensation in the throat and chest. Death is painful. You suffocate from it. Again, the problem was the weather. Mustard gas was the most deadly weapon used as well. It was fired into trenches and shells. It takes about 12, it's colorless, and so it takes about 12 hours to affect you. Effects include blistering skin, vomiting, sore eyes, internal and external bleeding, and you can die very slowly, up to 5 weeks of premature death. This is the gas attack at the Battle of Ypres. So you could see how important the wind is for that to work in certain directions. Okay. Mucus allergies. Again, planes and ships. So initially, planes relied on visual communication, but by 1950, they did develop primitive radio communication that would help out. As the war went on, the hours of flight time before a pilot became a casualty went from 300 flight hours to only 90. Planes malfunctioned frequently, and pilots didn't have parachutes. So, yeah, not that great to be in a plane. Flying aces. So this is the Red Baron. The fighter pilots in the First World War were known as flying aces. People became captivated by air combat, and these pilots often became like almost mythical heroes. Perhaps the most famous of the aces was Manfred von Richthofen, or the Red Baron. Richthofen was a master of formation tactics and carefully trained all of his German pilots on formations. They would attack from above, often using the sun as the blocker, and it created a lot of chaos. He ended up killing 80 planes, or taking down 80 planes before he was wounded in 1918. Okay, so now you understand, like, here we go. War starting, technology, all of that. But just as a reminder, why did the Schlieffen Plan fail?